David groaned as he pressed the elevator button, the fluorescent lights of the nearly empty office flickering overhead. It was well past midnight, and he was the last one to leave. Reports were due the next morning, and the weight of deadlines hung heavy on his shoulders. The silence of the building was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the elevator arriving. The silver doors slid open, revealing the all-too-familiar metallic interior. David stepped inside, the tired buzz in his head making him sluggish. He pressed the button for the ground floor, leaned back against the cold wall, and closed his eyes. The elevator hummed to life, descending smoothly for a few seconds before shuddering violently. The lights flickered, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The elevator jolted to a halt, and the soft ding of the doors opening broke the tension. When David opened his eyes, he froze. The elevator hadn't arrived at the ground floor. Instead, the doors revealed a corridor bathed in dim red light, stretching into an oppressive darkness. The walls seemed to pulsate faintly, like a living organism, and a strange metallic scent filled the air. The faint sound of whispers tickled the edges of his hearing, growing louder the longer he listened. "Hello?" David called, his voice trembling. The words echoed unnaturally down the corridor, twisting and warping until they no longer sounded like his own. Panicked, he pressed the button to close the doors. The elevator hesitated for a moment before obeying, shutting out the unnerving sight. David exhaled shakily and jabbed the button for the ground floor again. The elevator jolted, its hum now uneven and dissonant. The numbers on the display blinked erratically, showing symbols and shapes instead of numbers. David's heart pounded as he gripped the handrail. Ding! The doors opened again. This time the scene was even more surreal. David stared into a vast, starless void where the elevator seemed to hang in mid-air. The edges of the platform appeared to dissolve into nothingness. From the abyss, enormous glowing eyes blinked into existence, one by one, fixing on him. Their gaze was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his chest. "No, no, no," David muttered, slamming the button to close the doors. The elevator obeyed, but not before the eyes grew brighter, as if reaching for him. The ride continued, the elevator shaking and groaning as if protesting its very existence. David felt trapped, the air inside growing heavier with each passing second. Ding. The doors slid open once more. This time the elevator opened onto a scene of chaos, a room filled with shadowy figures writhing and screaming. Blood streaked the walls, pooling on the floor in thick, viscous puddles. The figures twisted and contorted unnaturally, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. One of them turned toward David, its eyeless face split into a grotesque grin. It began to move forward, reaching with elongated fingers that dripped with dark, ichorous fluid. David screamed and pounded the buttons frantically, begging the elevator to move. The doors closed just as the figure's hand nearly breached the threshold, leaving only a bloody smear on the steel. By now, David's sense of time had dissolved. The elevator's descent felt endless, the flickering lights and warped sounds disorienting him further. Each stop brought a new horror. A twisted reflection of his childhood home, where the laughter of his younger self echoed ominously through the halls. A forest bathed in perpetual twilight, where shadows danced with malevolent intent. A decrepit carnival, with rusted rides and a carousel turning endlessly without music. The horses had eyes that followed him. Each time the doors opened, David prayed for escape. But each time, he was greeted with another nightmare. Finally, the elevator shuddered violently and came to a halt. The display above the doors read, "Ground floor." The ding sounded different this time, deeper, more final. The doors opened, and David saw the familiar lobby of his office. Relief flooded through him as he stumbled out, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. The receptionist's desk was there, the glass doors leading to the parking lot beyond. Everything looked normal. But something gnawed at the edges of his mind. Turning back to the elevator, David froze. The doors were still open, and inside stood another version of himself. The doppelganger's face was twisted into a malicious grin, and its eyes were pitch black. Before David could react, the elevator doors slammed shut, and the light above blinked to up. The elevator began to ascend, taking whatever had impersonated him with it. Terrified, David turned to leave, but the glass doors were gone. In their place was another elevator. Its doors slid open with a low groan, revealing nothing but blackness inside. Behind him, the lobby lights began to flicker. The faint sound of the elevator dinging echoed endlessly in his ears. David was trapped, and deep down, he knew the ride wasn't over. It started as a dare. 5 teenagers, Jake, Lisa, Mia, Eric, and Sarah, stood at the gates of Hillcrest Academy, a school abandoned for over 30 years. The local legend claimed it was haunted by the spirit of a deranged janitor who had vanished after a series of grisly murders. The town called him the Silent Sweeper. The school loomed in the moonlight, its windows broken like jagged teeth, and the peeling paint on its walls whispered tales of its tragic past. Armed with flashlights and bravado, the group ventured inside. The air was stale and heavy, the corridors littered with crumbling textbooks, desks overturned as if the students had fled in a panic. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if something unseen was walking with them. "This place gives me the creeps," Mia muttered, gripping Sarah's arm. "Relax," Jake said, forcing a laugh. "It's just an old building." But as they moved deeper into the school, strange things began to happen. A locker slammed shut by itself. Faint whispers drifted from nowhere, too quiet to make out, but loud enough to send shivers down their spines. In the gymnasium, the group found a message scrawled in red paint across the wall. "You shouldn't have come." "Very funny," Eric said, rolling his eyes. "Probably just some kids messing around." "No one's been here in years," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the sound of a faint metallic scraping echoed through the gym. Jake swung his flashlight wildly, illuminating a trail of fresh, bloody footprints leading out of the gym and into the hall. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice breaking. No answer. The group followed the trail cautiously, their nerves fraying with every step. The footprints led to the music room. Inside, an old piano sat eerily untouched. As they approached, one of the keys pressed itself down with a sharp, discordant note, and then the lights went out. Mia screamed as a cold hand brushed against her shoulder. The group scrambled for their flashlights, their beams slicing through the suffocating darkness. Standing in the corner was a figure. It was tall, with a filthy jumpsuit and a face obscured by a mask, fashioned from shards of broken mirror. In one hand, it clutched a rusted mop, its head dripping with blood. "It's him," Sarah whispered, barely audible. "The sweeper." The figure moved with impossible speed, lunging at Eric. He barely dodged the attack, the mop striking the ground with a sickening thud. The group scattered, their screams echoing through the empty halls. They ran blindly, turning corner after corner, but the layout of the school seemed to shift, twisting into a maze. Jake led them to a classroom and slammed the door shut. They barricaded it with desks, their breaths ragged. "He's not a ghost," Jake hissed. "He's real." "What does he want?" Mia sobbed. "To clean us up," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "That's what the stories said. He thought the students were dirty and needed to be punished." A sudden pounding on the door silenced them. The sweeper's raspy breathing seeped through the cracks. "There's got to be another way out," Lisa whispered, shining her flashlight around. Her beam landed on a trap door in the floor. One by one, they descended into the basement. The air was damp and foul, the walls lined with shelves of cleaning supplies long since decayed. "This way," Jake urged, leading them through the labyrinthine basement. But the sweeper was relentless. He appeared ahead of them, emerging from the shadows as if he had always been there. His mirrored mask reflected their terrified faces as he swung his mop. Lisa wasn't fast enough. The mop struck her, and she fell to the ground with a scream. The others kept running, guilt and terror propelling them forward. Finally, they found a ladder leading to a storm drain. Jake pushed the grate open, and one by one, they climbed out into the cold night air. But when they looked around, Sarah was missing. The group's relief turned to dread as they realized the grate had slammed shut behind them. Through the slats, they saw the sweeper dragging Sarah back into the darkness, her screams fading into silence. Hillcrest Academy remained quiet the next day. The 3 survivors never spoke of what happened, but the legend of the silent sweeper grew. Every so often, new footprints appeared at the school gates, leading inside. No one ever saw those who followed them again. Nina walked through the heavy iron doors of Cedarbrook Psychiatric Clinic, clutching the crumpled letter of acceptance she had received a week ago. It wasn't her dream job, far from it, but she needed the work. The clinic was known for its advanced treatments and high success rate, but rumors of odd occurrences in the halls were whispered amongst the medical community. Still, Nina pushed them to the back of her mind as she was shown around by a cheery nurse named Janet. As they walked past the long, dimly lit corridors, Nina noticed something strange: the patients. Some stared blankly into space while others fidgeted nervously in their rooms. A few muttered to themselves in low, unintelligible voices. Janet explained the clinic's special treatment programs, but when Nina asked about the staff, Janet quickly changed the subject. "It's a stressful job," Janet said with a tight smile, "but we all do our best." On her first day in the ward, Nina was introduced to the staff. Most were friendly enough, but one person stood out: Samuel, a tall, grim-looking orderly with sharp eyes that never seemed to blink. His reputation preceded him. Whispers of cruel games, manipulation, and disturbing behavior were carried in hushed tones throughout the halls. "He's just strict," Janet had said, brushing it off with a nervous laugh. The patients seemed to regard Samuel with a mix of fear and confusion. They would flinch when he passed by, their eyes wide with dread. Nina tried to remain professional, but she couldn't shake the unease she felt whenever he was near. That evening, Nina witnessed something that made her blood run cold. She was assigned to monitor a group of patients during the evening shift. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m., the patients began to grow restless. Samuel entered the ward, his presence alone making the air feel thicker, as though something invisible was closing in. He glanced at Nina and gave her a slight, unsettling smile before turning his attention to a patient named Mark. Mark had been in the clinic for years, his mind fractured from a traumatic incident. He spent most of his time mumbling to himself, locked in his own world. Samuel crouched beside him, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Mark," he said softly, "do you remember the rules of the game?" Mark looked up at him, his eyes wide and unblinking. "The rules," he whispered. Samuel's smile grew colder as he nodded. "Good, let's play." Without warning, Samuel produced a small black box and placed it on the table in front of Mark. He whispered something inaudible to the patient, who trembled in response. Nina, curious and disturbed, watched from a distance as Samuel gestured for Mark to open the box. Mark's hands shook as he lifted the lid, revealing a simple puzzle with moving pieces. It seemed harmless enough, but Nina saw the terror in Mark's eyes. "Faster, Mark," Samuel said, his voice laced with an edge. "Time is running out." Nina couldn't tear her gaze away. Mark began to solve the puzzle, but as he did, his hands started to bleed. The more he moved the pieces, the worse the cuts became, as if the puzzle itself was tearing into his skin. He whimpered, but Samuel only watched with an unsettling calmness, his eyes never leaving the patient. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the soft clicking of the puzzle pieces and Mark's anguished breathing. Nina felt a cold chill crawl down her spine. She wanted to intervene, but something in Samuel's gaze kept her rooted to the spot. "Stop, please!" Mark cried out, his voice breaking. Samuel leaned in close, his breath cold against Mark's ear. "Finish the game, or it's you who will suffer." With trembling hands, Mark pushed the final piece into place. As soon as he did, the puzzle clicked shut with a sickening finality. The bleeding stopped, and Mark collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Samuel calmly stood, straightening his uniform as if nothing had happened. "Good game," Samuel said, his voice smooth and cold. "I'll be back tomorrow." Nina's heart raced as she rushed over to Mark, but Samuel was already gone. The others in the ward were eerily silent, watching her with hollow eyes as though they had seen this all before. The next day, Nina's shift took an unexpected turn. Samuel seemed to watch her closely, his eyes always following her movements with a strange intensity. By the end of her shift, she was exhausted, unsettled by what she had witnessed, but she couldn't bring herself to speak out. The staff would never believe her. Samuel was far too respected, and the patient's stories were dismissed as the delusions of the mentally ill. But that night, as Nina was walking to her car, she felt a sharp tug at her sleeve. She turned, and there was Samuel, standing in the shadows just outside the clinic. "You're next," he said in a low, menacing voice. "It's time you played." Nina tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move. The world around her seemed to blur, the ground beneath her feet becoming soft as though she were sinking into darkness. She realized then that she was no longer standing outside the clinic. The walls of the ward had shifted, twisting into a distorted version of the clinic, hallways that stretched endlessly, doors that led to nowhere. Samuel appeared at her side, his smile wider, more predatory now. "Welcome to the game, Nina. You'll learn the rules soon enough." Suddenly, Nina was surrounded by patients, many of them the same ones she had seen the night before, their eyes blank and unseeing. But as they began to whisper, their voices grew louder, more frantic. They were speaking in a language she couldn't understand, their faces contorting in unnatural ways. One patient, a man she recognized as James, reached out to her, his fingers like claws. "We all played the game," he rasped, his voice warped and unnatural. "Now we're part of it. You can't escape." Nina screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Samuel's laughter echoed through the empty halls as the walls closed in around her. The game had begun.